Um, Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for coming along at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning. I feel I should begin by saying congratulations. My name is John McAuliffe. I'm Professor of Poetry here at the School of Arts at the University of Manchester, and I'm also Director of Creative Manchester, which is hosting this set of events today. Creative Manchester is an interdisciplinary research platform where we try and put together researchers from different disciplines to answer kind of key challenges and research questions today. And we're really delighted to be running this set of events. And we're going to be starting today. And I'm going to hand over in a moment to our chair, Professor Sadia Qureshi, who's going to tell you about our fantastic panel. However, I'm also just going to let you know that as you will know, there are ongoing protests at the university, and while we're not anticipating any disruption other than the 1-2 of the sound check across the way, if there are any disruptions, we have a full risk assessment of what we will do, and we'll be allowing protesters to speak, and then we'll be returning to discussion. So I'm going to hand over now to Professor Sadia Qureshi.
Thank you so much for making it out for the first event of the day. It is an immense pleasure and honour to welcome you all here today, especially with such an illustrious panel. So as John said, I'm Sadia Qureshi, and I'll be chairing the event. And joining me are three wonderful speakers who are all my colleagues in the History Department at the University of Manchester. How lucky am I? So I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. First, we have Professor Anna Carden-Coyne. She's Director of the Centre for the Cultural History of War here, with particular expertise in histories of war, trauma, and disability. Among her most important works are a book called The Politics of Wounds, Military Patience and Medical Power in the First World War, and she recently co-curated a magnificent exhibition at the Whitworth Art Gallery called Traces of Displacement. If you didn't get to see that, you can catch some of the highlights from that exhibition in a book that is forthcoming next year called Displacement Aesthetics, History, Art and Refugees, appearing next year. In addition, she developed the MA History course here in documentary filmmaking at the University of Manchester with Michael Wood and Rebecca Dobbs at their production company, where Michael and David both teach. So how lucky are our students? So next we have Professor David Olusoga, who is a broadcaster, writer, presenter and professor of public history here. You may know him from any number of groundbreaking TV series in recent years, some with accompanying fabulous books, including The World's War, Forgotten Soldiers of Empire, Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, Black and British: A Forgotten History, Civilizations, A House Through Time, and most recently, Union. He's won 2 BAFTAs, with the most recent one a special award and recognition for his services to television. Finally, but not by any means least, we have the broadcaster and writer Professor Michael Wood here, who is also a professor of public history. His extraordinarily important and prolific career spans my entire life. I worked this out while I was doing this. Oh, God. So, because I was trying to figure out what to say. So I'm going to mention one series from each decade of his career. So we start with In Search of the Dark Ages. I'm not going to say how old because I don't want to say how old I am. Then The Doomsday Quest. Then In the Footsteps of Alexander the Great, The Story of India, The Story of China. He's also a beautiful writer, and his most recent book is China's Greatest Poets, In the Footsteps of Du Fu. So please can you welcome me in welcoming our speakers today. So I'm going to begin with a few questions to our speakers to get things going, and then I will allow questions from the floor. There will be roving mics that will come to you, so if you just have a think about what you'd like to ask, and we'll open it up. Okay. But can I please begin by just asking the panel how each of you became interested in or involved with TV in your own careers? Let's start with Anna.
Well, I think I was a young student, but maybe straight out of school, and I first saw a film by Claude Lanzmann called Shoah, which was the most extraordinary. I mean, it was something like a 9-hour documentary. It made a massive impact on me. I'd never seen anything like it. It didn't have any... it was about the Holocaust. It was purely based on testimony and investigation. It had a sort of journalistic quality to it, but there was no archive at all. And why that was so incredible at the time, because most of us knew the Holocaust through archival photographs and sort of very disturbing, distressing images. So that was also at a time in it was 1985 that it came out, it must have been 1990 that I saw it. And I think it was at a time when the discipline of history was really also thinking about memory and what is memory, and memory studies was emerging. And the question was, we understand history as through documents, and can we think about it through how we remember, and what is memory, and do societies remember? So that was probably the most fascinating question, an intellectual question about why do we privilege documents, and what about how people remember, and why do they remember, and why are their memories either hidden or not part of history or marginalised? And I think that is also a question of why certain documents privilege certain narratives. And film can make those questions really live. So that's probably my going back to my youth moment of what made me become a historian and study history at university.
I really think historians should be better at telling our origin stories, so thank you so much. Michael?
Yeah, two things I'd say. I mean, first of all, I grew up, as to become TV literate back in the 1960s when there were only 2 channels. And at that time, there was an incredible series called The Great War. And, I was about, 12 or 13 when it came out, but it was transfixingly powerful. All it was the things that we all compose our films out of: archive, interviews, music, sound effects. But the power of his great historical events was just awesome in that. And I never forgot that. Personally, if you ask me how I got into television, I had no intention of doing that. And I guess being a kind of kid from Wythenshawe, I thought that I'd be a teacher of history at Palmswick Grammar School. But after university, I got a job as a journalist, and I did 6 years as a journalist before the mast, which I think is very helpful for doing history of television. And in 1975, I got given the chance in the extra long local news program on a Monday night to do a 15-minute film. And I chose to do it about the great miners' lockout and the shooting of the miners at Featherstone in 1893, the last time on the British mainland that troops have shot and killed people. And that was my first attempt, with no training at all, to construct a historical narrative. And I still treasure the letter from the president of the Yorkshire Mine Workers Union, Arthur Scargill, who wrote, you can guess it, "Dear Brother Wood, on behalf of the Yorkshire Miners Union, I'd like to compliment you on your," the basic tone was, "If you're ever down on your luck, there's always pie and peas for you in Wombwell." But those are the two things, really.
David?
Well, I've told this story before. It's slightly odd to tell it in this context, because what made me interested in history and history on television was Michael Wood. It was watching those series in the 80s. I had a troubled time at school. History was the only thing I was good at. But what Michael's series did was they made me aware for the first time of the fundamental magic of history, which is that for the first time I realized these events took place physically in the place where I lived, and the countryside, that you could walk around Britain and you were walking around where our ancestors had walked around. Years later, like most historians, I discovered the great quote by Trevelyan, that the quasi-magical thing about history is that other people just like us walk this earth as real as we are, as actual as we are, and that they're all now gone, like we'll all one day be gone. And that sort of magic of history and place, I've got for the first time watching In Search of the Dark Ages. So slightly ironically, it was this man here.
So sweet of you. How
Inter-
about you, though, Sadia?
I have always been obsessed with of making sense of things, and I began as a student of natural sciences, and I very, very quickly thought, this is teaching me how things work, but not why. And then I switched to the history of science, and from there started doing a PhD thinking about exhibitions and public history. So I've always been really, really interested in how we communicate things, to, especially historical knowledge, but how things work and their roots. So, yeah, absolutely. So building on that moment of intergenerational love and joy, I would like to talk about the history of television on TV, and perhaps, David, you could begin here by asking you to reflect on the broader development of history on TV, and then perhaps Michael and Anna can come in, especially Michael, on how kind of he broke the mold as a TV presenter, but let's get you started.
I mean, to me, history on television has been a slow, gradual escape from the university lecture. Because when history began on television, historians, almost all of whom had gone to Oxbridge, who worked for the BBC, the only form of history storytelling they knew was the lecture. So they got their lecturers to come down and they filmed their lectures. H.E.P. Taylor happened to be an incredible lecturer who could just stand there and for a perfect 30 minutes, or a BBC minute, which is half hour, which is 28 minutes, 30 seconds, hit exactly the mark, not run into the 9 o'clock news, and deliver an astonishing story. And you were left wondering what the causes of the First World War were. And he did it so well that I don't think it elucidated many of the problems, which is that television has much, much more potential as a storytelling medium. So I think we've been gradually, for decades, trying to get away from that start, which was just, was the lecture televised. And I think we are still evolving and still developing, trying to find ways, different styles. And if you think television history has morphed into many different genres. There's drama documentary, there's presenter-led documentary, there's archive documentary, there's living history where you put people in a Victorian house or a Victorian farm. All of this experimentation, some of it more successful than others, has been about trying to see how do we use this remarkable medium in a way that's more thoughtful than the lecture. I think some of the big developments with the Civilization series, even though it was history of art rather than, some people would say it wasn't historical enough, it was too much about analysing paintings, but it was out there. It was location broadcasting, recorded on location on the road. Michael's programs that took the landscape, and Michael getting in a helicopter and going around Britain seemed revolutionary at the time. It has been a slow development, and I still think there's a lot of things that television could do and should do better. There's some habits that we've got into that we need to question.
So, Michael.
Like what, David? Can I pick you up on that?
Well, I think the declarative form of presenting, where a presenter is the person who's leading you on a story and telling you their opinions, rather than somebody. I mean, one of the cliches, because I'm a producer as well as a presenter, one of the cliches is that presenters not wanting to ask open questions. And so you get these questions where someone says what they think and then says to the interviewee, do you agree? Rather than what do you think? And I think trying to get away from the idea of the presenter as always the person who's delivering knowledge, and sometimes the person who's receiving knowledge. It's one of the great ways of picking up knowledge is to be an eavesdropper, a third party in a two-way conversation. And we've not been very good at doing that.
Do you think that reflects, in some ways, the actual discipline of history, that our aim is to have an argument? So when we write peer-reviewed research, the whole point of the peer review is to have an argument that makes a difference. And so perhaps TV is still sort of hanging on to that single researcher, single presenter type model, rather than a more open conversation where things could evolve.
I'm not sure there's lots of ways that mentality could infect television history. I think there's been there's a thing called moral license, that if you think you're doing good, you don't ask difficult questions about yourself. And I think the television history is full of earnest people who want to feel the power of history, who want to bring it to other people. And we've not been great at asking ourselves, is this good enough? Is this the best way of delivering television? I mean, one of the things that I always do is, I call it infanticide, that you write down all the stories that you can tell and you work out which are the best stories, not the ones that matter most to you, not the ones you most want to tell, not the ones that politically it's most advantageous to tell, but what is actually the best story. And there's story theory to think about here. What are the actual best stories? And I don't think we're very good at that.
Do you think there's a problem that deep-rooted in television history that if you're a working historian, you know that there's no one explanation for things, and there's always multiple causes. You can never simply explain an event. You can never even isolate the individual strands that go into a story, whereas TV is completely narrative-driven, and that within that hour that you're making a program, people want you to tell a story with a beginning and an end. And even if the story's not really there, as a program maker, it's quite easy to think, well, how do we just shape that to make a satisfying hour?
So building on that, what brought you to break the mold in terms of how you were presenting, Michael? Now you presented those stories to the public.
Well, it's kind of you to say that I broke the mold, and I'm not sure that I necessarily did. It's all a continuum, isn't it? But the thing was, when we've made our first programs, I was working here in Manchester on BBC Two Current Affairs. So I was going out and making films about the miners, so the nuclear industry or things like that. And then we got our boss said we could go and make a single film about Offa, the king of the Anglo-Saxons, and we were just kind of two men and a dog without the dog, if you know what I mean. I mean, it was real. We had 2 weeks to film. And everything was done so primitively in those days. I make kids laugh today when I say that when we say a film, we actually mean they were shot on a piece of celluloid that went through a gate of a camera and had to be developed, and then you cut it up and hung it up and stuck it together. And graphics were, you got a guy in graphics to paint a map, and then it went down to the basement and somebody shot it. It was so primitive, and the budgets were so small that we were just, and we didn't think we were going to carry on doing things like that because we worked in current affairs. So initially, it was slightly kind of devil-may-care. You're standing in front of Ripon and you're thinking, how are we going to make the Eric Bloodaxe's burning of Ripon come alive? And we borrowed a blowtorch from the local garage to make the air wobble in front of the camera, that sort of thing. It was so basic. So it wasn't a planned, and it was the same with the helicopter gag, just doing a piece of camera in a helicopter. Let's take the safety belt off because it'll look better if I'm standing in the window. So the whole thing was a bit, it just happened. And I think because we were young and jolly, we did it in that way. There were critics in the academic world who thought this was. Yeah. Experts in Carolingian kingship who said, you shouldn't have used that illustration of Charles Bald, But, so it kind of happened haphazardly, really. I wasn't even sure I was going to stay in television at that stage, to be honest. I had a doctorate to finish that I really wanted to do, I'm turning now to finishing it.
Best of luck. As someone finishing a book, I highly sympathise with that current situation. By the way, if any of you haven't seen any of these shows, you could easily spend several days on YouTube going through from AJP Taylor, Michael Wood, Dave. It's just extraordinary.
Well, 26 hours of the Great War series, which I have watched all 26 hours.
Yeah. It's quite something.
Which is also a great literary work, and I think that's the other element. Is TV is about pictures, but it is also a literary medium. And I think one of the things it's getting better at and got still to get better at is the quality of the writing.
Yes.
And TV is loaded with cliches. There is a sort of almost a belief that you can't make television without cliches. And when I get comments from editors and commissioners, it's very often pointing out cliches that I've deliberately missed, as if they just haven't occurred to me, as if I sort of, I'm sort of have cliche blindness. Not that I'm sort of, following Martin Amis in the war against cliche. But I think what was innovative about what you did in the longer stretch of history was, I think, two things. One is, I think the writing was really good. The other thing, the writing admitted to the doubt that we don't know. There was as much about what we don't know, what we can't know, what we'll never know. There was just that acknowledgement that this is not perfect, that this is as close as we can get to these people who are as real as we are. And that fear of doubt, that fear of the desire to tell a clean story, that's been the thing that's made television history bifurcate from history as a discipline. And trying to escape from that, to me, is the most important thing. I think the most important history program of the past probably 15 years, 20 years, is probably a program I don't like very much as a viewer, which is Who Do You Think You Are? Because Who Do You Think You Are did two really important things. One is it was about process. It was no longer, here's what we know, it's here's how we got to know it. And the other thing was it put on screen documents. And when I started as a young history producer in the late 90s, whenever I wanted to film a document, my bosses would say documents, they would always append a pejorative. They'd say they were dry, dusty, boring, old. There was always a negative thing about documents. And Who Do You Think You Are showed, if you have the right emotional narrative build-up to a document, a piece of paper that reveals the fate of a human being, delivered to the right person, explained by the right historian, is an incredibly dramatic device. And that allowed lots of programs that have followed that have been based on documents. I made a series called Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, which is about 40% me sat in the National Archives with ledgers. I could not have made that program if How Do You Think You Are had not happened, because they would have said there's no explosions. Why aren't you running around a field? Or, couldn't you shout at someone or something like that? Have a row. But this idea that a document could be dramatic. Who Do You Think You Are? Which is a series flawed in all sorts of ways. I would advise you to read Adam Rutherford's writing about how genetics actually works, because everyone's related to Edward II. You don't have to be an East End actor to be related to Edward II. And it is nonsense at that level. It's still been really important in the history of television.
The sources are absolutely crucial and fabulous too. Yeah. And I always felt I wanted the audience to see this is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It's really, don't you think, Anna? Sources are the.
I think obviously I'm a historian. I love sources. I can't help it. I'm addicted to the archive. Yeah. I also love images and what people make, the material culture of history. But just picking up on David's point, I think there's something also about Who Do You Think You Are and maybe it's also other documentaries too. It's about emotions, and I think we love to think we're sort of objective and dry and sort of, very measured and intellectual, which we are, of course, all of those things. But what those programs do is they attach an emotion, and that makes it a bit more personal. Now, okay, they can overdo it a bit, where everyone's like, crying about the document, and I'm related to King Henry VIII, which you probably are not. But it's nevertheless, I think that is a shift. That's a cultural shift that's going on in Britain, perhaps, to actually allow people to have a voice, but also people to actually express their emotions around the past. And that's a good thing, I think.
Even to admit to having emotions. I mean, the phrase I find myself saying when I'm presenting, when I put myself in those situations, was I don't know what to think about this.
Right.
And that sense that there is no neat, clear answer, that these are dilemmas for us to think about as they were for our ancestors to experience them. I think that's really important to escape from that idea of a clinical detachment.
Yeah, and the
because
didactics.
Actually, after a couple of drinks, historians are completely capable of talking about their emotional relationship to the past. And there's this veneer of detachment.
Right. Yeah,
and I think, you wouldn't do these things. You wouldn't spend months in archives. You wouldn't travel, ridiculous distances and stand out in the cold and go places and walk off as dyke if you didn't have an emotional as well as an intellectual connection. And the reticence of revealing that, of being open about that, I think that's beginning to break down. I think it's beginning to break down in writing as well as in television. I think we're just more emotionally literate, as the decades pass.
I do think it's something, as someone who moved to the UK from Australia in 2003, when I came to work at the Centre for the Cultural History of War, and that's the following year when I set up the documentary film course here, which Michael's been a fundamental part. I just sort of feel like, we are making massive changes as well. Like, it's been very slow. But one thing I love about Britain, that's why I'm still here, is people love the past. They love it. They really believe in it. And they're so interested. And history is such a popular subject in the UK. And I feel really privileged to be part of that. And I think history documentaries in the UK are really done very, very well. And they're world leading in many ways. So it's also down to the audience that we have a huge number of people in the UK who really want to understand the past in all of its complexity, its pain, its suffering, and maybe to dig a little, people are now willing to dig a little deeper into the awful stuff as well. And that's starting to scratch the surface. It's not just a story of glory. There's also some really nasty stuff we're going to have to look at.
So I think this is really, really crucial, and I want to bring in another question here, which is to ask the panel about the gap between history as a form of scholarship and as it's presented on TV. Because my sense is that gap is narrower than ever, and certainly as a professional historian, like if I come away having watched a documentary feeling like I've learnt something, but I feel like the process of history has been discussed and so on, I feel really, really pleased about that. But, the idea that you couldn't have put a document on TV, at a certain point, it strikes me as just extraordinary. So what do you think about that gap, and how can we kind of close it even more? And not just in terms of thinking about professional academics, but also the kind of local histories and community histories and so on that are just flourishing all over the country.
I think the genealogy revolution has been part of this. That more people than ever have been in archives, the digitization of records. People have had that personal experience of clicking on and seeing the death certificate or birth certificate of their ancestors. So I think some of this is that the audience is more willing and less intimidated by the idea of documents. I never think they thought they were that intimidated. I think TV had a sort of dark night of the soul at some point in the sort of 90s and noughties, where everything had to be a drama reconstruction. And as someone who made some of those drama reconstructions, they were pretty rubbish.
The good old reenactment.
Well, I live in Bristol. I've made lots of programs about the 18th century, the early 19th century. And a sizable proportion of the population of Bath will dress up as Regency gentlemen if you ask them to for nothing. And I literally...
There you go, we love it. It's a British thing.
And I actually think that's a really important point by Anna as well. You're talking about the audience being literate about documents. Also, I'm half Nigerian. My father was Nigerian, and he regarded my desire to be a historian as a mild form of mental illness. He didn't understand it when you could be an engineer or something useful. And I think our obsession with history can seem strange to other countries. I mean, the biggest membership organization in Europe is the National Trust. If you do our list of top 10 tourist destinations that British people go to as well as people who come to Britain, it's ancient cathedrals, it's museums and art galleries. It's not water parks or theme parks. I think there's lots of countries where the people who own water slides aren't worrying about the museum down the road, taking its audience. So there is something oddly obsessive about the British when it comes to history.
It's supposed to be the biggest leisure participation activity in the UK history. I mean, I haven't looked at the stats since COVID, actually, but at that time it was something like 70 million museum visits a year, membership of National Trust, English Heritage, local history societies and all that. So more people do history every week than go to football matches. So there is although history is a small part of the school's curriculum, it's a big part of people's perception of the world.
The membership of the National Trust is 33 times that of the Conservative Party. I just happened to have worked out recently for some reason.
there.
Don't know,
I think I might
don't
want
know
it that
how
way
I
around.
happen to be Googling that.
I'm going to use that.
So,
Actually, so this just occurs to me. Do you think that's partly why this investment in history as a form of leisure activity makes some people so uncomfortable with stories that have been traditionally erased or that they simply do not want to encounter because they want history to be something that feels good or fun? I mean,
Yeah, they don't want to know that history is dangerous. When all this revision happened with the National Trust and other organisations looking at the slavery links, there literally was a Tory think tank saying this was a stab in the back to the nation.
Anna, what do you think? Because of course, Australia is a brilliant example of a nation that has been through history wars over reconciling itself with so many different aspects of its past, whether it's genocide, whether it's colonial histories and so on.
Well, thank you for asking me that question. It's an important... thank you. It's an important one. So one of the most popular tourist attraction of Australia is not the Harbour Bridge or the Sydney Opera House. It's the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. And a huge amount of investment goes into it. It's one of the most publicly funded institutions. And I don't know if anybody watched recently Rachel Perkins, and she's an Australian filmmaker. It was screened on the BBC. It's called The Australian Wars. And it's the first time that this, not controversial to historians, the work has been done for decades, about the battles, the small wars that were fought during the early colonial period against the Aboriginal people. And we're talking about the murder of about 100,000 people between 1788 and the early 1930s, and the whole sort of genocide of the Australian Indigenous population. And although this is known about, it's taught in schools, it's not really a public conversation. Now, of course, this film was screened, I think it was screened before the Voice to Parliament vote, which was lost. The Indigenous people lost that vote, a national referendum. But the aim of that film is amazing. I mean, it's historians, it's reenactments, it's archives, it's documents, it's first-person testimony, it's intergenerational conversations, it's cinematic, because she's a filmmaker. She's a movie maker, she's a Hollywood movie maker, and it's beautifully shot in full cinema. But what she does, it's incredible, and has a narrator, is questioning the documents. It's like, the documents are wrong. They do not record these deaths. They do not record the violence. They do not record the poisoning of the waterholes. And also the point of that film was a piece of activism, a really brave piece of activism, which was to ask the Australian War Memorial, which honours the deaths of veterans of Australia's wars, to include the Indigenous people as also victims of conflict, that the Australian frontier wars have been ignored, not by historians, we know about this work, but by TV, by public, etc. And lo and behold, the Australian War Memorial said, in 2028, okay, it's a few years in part, we will start doing this work. So, okay, they're going to take 4 years to figure it out. But what it shows is that television history can actually make a massive public difference in a way that a referendum could not.
Yeah. I mean, the programme that I've made that I'm most proud of is not one anyone associates with me, because I was the producer, not the presenter. The presenter was David Lammy, and it was revealing the biggest, I think, scandal I've ever encountered as an historian, which is the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Again, war graves. Again, memorialisation of war. That organisation had not given equal treatment to black and Asian soldiers after the First World War. That documentary, which we made for Channel 4, with David Lammy presenting it, it was very purposefully to have David Lammy because he could use the documentary and then his position as a Member of Parliament to campaign that led to to a change of leadership at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. It led to an apology by the Prime Minister and by the Secretary of State for Defence in Parliament, and a public statement and a report by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who are now 3 years into a restorative justice action to try to reclaim some of the information that they told historians like myself and Michel Barrett for years that they couldn't do. So there are now graves and mass graves in East Africa that are going to be exhumed because of a television documentary. Now, Michel had written a paper on that 15 years ago. I'd written it in a book I wrote in 2014 that had no impact. A documentary on television presented by a politician, led to this catalytic process that has led to actual change. So I was with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission earlier this year with one of their researchers in Kenya who has found what happened to a young Kenyan man who was conscripted forcibly into the British Army in the Second World War, and whose widow, because they were teenagers at the time, never knew what happened to him. And they found them at the records of when and how he had died and where he was buried. And this old woman in rural Kenya has that information that has been missing from her life for 80 years because of a television documentary. So the power of TV documentary can be astonishing. It can really bring about change.
So how can we use that power for better ahead? Because there are so many histories and stories that have been either been deliberately neglected or erased. And obviously, David, one of the reasons that you got your BAFTA was for doing so much work towards bringing those histories to several generations of TV watchers, I would say. And I think it's becoming even more imperative that we use that kind of the power of TV to do that. So how can we do that? And especially given that we still have so many issues with representation, not just in front of the screen, but behind it, with commissioners and producers and so on. Maybe start with you with that.
Well, I think it's not a brilliant time. 68% of TV freelance producers are out of work. TV is going through its biggest retraction, its biggest shrinkage that I've ever known. It probably grew because of the pandemic, because of the emergence of new channels, more than was sustainable. So this is not just a downturn, it's a correction, and it's a really, really painful one that's affecting lots of people I care about. But I think also that instinctive... TV is full of people who don't quite believe the audience care about things that they do care about. You can tell them the statistics about the National Trust and about the visitor attractions in this country. And I think deep down, a lot of people in television think people are watching history documentaries because they can't get their remote control to turn to EastEnders. And they don't quite believe it. And throughout my career in television, I've heard people in senior positions say what I think are kind of dumb things about history on television. I've had people say that they want to be at war with documentary. Very recently, the head of Channel 4 said he didn't want any more history documentaries. No, I mean, they're still commissioning them. But it's a genre that people in the television industry feel it's okay to trash. Every now and then, every few years, every couple of decades, someone in power will say that this is a terrible medium that has no future. So the death of TV history is always sort of being declared and never quite happening. So I think that sort of background hostility to the genre is there within a television industry. And I think TV's got the same problem that politics has, is it's run by people who are professional TV people. They've done nothing else. All they do is television. Like, have these people who are special advisors, then they become MPs. They've never been in business, never, worked for charity, worked in academia. They've never done anything else. So I think there is a kind of instinctive hostility that you find within TV to history documentaries, which flares up every now and then. And I think we are in a kind of odd moment where I can feel it flaring up. And also, I'm afraid, I think, again, one of TV's worst instincts as an industry is it sees diversity as a luxury. If there's lots of money, if things are going well, then working class histories, women's histories, the histories of minoritized people, yeah, we've got time for that. But I mean, yesterday, Lenny Henry announced his drama Three Little Birds has been stopped. The commissioning power, the number of hours of history documentary have declined really remarkably in the past 5 years. So TV as a medium can do amazing things with history. TV as an industry with its own internal culture is the bit that I worry about.
I think there's a big contrast between what David's just described and the fact of such widespread interest. And when you look broadly at the industry, the diversification of points of view is really to be welcomed, and it's changed massively over the last 20 years. And you probably think I'm claiming too much for history, but I've been very impressed by people like Danielle Allen at Harvard, who's part of America's got a National Council for Public History, and they are concerned about how history can play a role in creating a more democratic society. That sounds enormous, but if democracy depends on the informed consent of the governed, not just the consent, but the informed consent of the governed, then actually knowing about your history and being able to rationally combat the tide of rubbish that is coming out, not merely from social media and everything else, but even from distinguished academics in Cambridge University. That's a big help, and history teaches many things, but it teaches judgment of sources is one of the big things, So I think that there is a debate to be had about the role of history in our culture, and TV, for all the multi-channel universe we're now in, will play a big part in that, I think.
I suppose one thing I'm thinking about really is students. I think students, we teach this MA course in teaching young historians how to make documentary films, and they learn very quickly in a one semester. It's not a whole degree, it's just a short course. And, young people are so good at the technology. They're just so good at it. And armed with the rigour of history, plus the storytelling modality that filmmaking allows, I think the future is also in their hands too. I think young people are really pushing the boundaries, and we can see that when we look at their documentaries. They're just what they achieve in such a short time. And I sort of feel like, well, maybe that old guard in that industry, they're just going to have to move over because the young people are coming.
Very loudly, with a lot of energy. I just am bowled over by students, and they're extraordinary. When I was a student, I was just very timid and wanted to learn and so on, but the sort of political engagement and power of the students coming through that I teach now, I think is really inspiring and extraordinary. So we have many hopes for them, but as the elders, we also need to do a better job to bequeath them better. So my last question before I open up to the floor would be, what do you think we can do for the future of television? Where next? What would you want to see? Either in who can be a historian, what kinds of histories are told, or what do we need? And what do we hope for and dream for?
I dreamed for a better Media Act than the one that's just been passed, which doesn't give protection to genres like history, arts, religion on television. We've just passed a communications bill that I think is an enabling act for the reduction of public service broadcasting. So I'm, as I said, I think now is a slightly worrying time. But the thing is, the people who don't believe that people actually want to engage with history are wrong. They're wrong, and I think the podcast revolution shows them that they're wrong. I think the book sales, the literary industry shows them that they're wrong. TV repeatedly decides that history sort of is a niche subject, despite the statistics, despite the audiences. Like all people on television, I look at my audiences, and I make programs that regularly get the same audience as dramas that cost a fraction of dramas. Drama never has to say, honestly, it's worthwhile, we're justifiable, because television's instinct is that will bring in audiences. We have very strange conversations in television where things are deemed to be a success that didn't get audiences because people believe that's the sort of thing that would be successful. So I hope Anna's right, and that the people who are the gatekeepers on television are going to lose control of that gatekeeping power, because I don't think they've done a very good job.
I think young people also maybe aren't even interested in mainstream TV. They're doing films on YouTube, and they have alternative ways of getting their voice and their message out there. And they have audiences. They get a lot of likes. So they have viewing numbers, or on Vimeo, or whatever it might be. So I think that there are so many alternatives to mainstream TV as well that provides opportunities for young voices to come through. And perhaps that's another thing. What I would like to see more of, I would like to see more history, TV history around, of course, working class history, women's history, but also young people's history. I'd like to hear more about the history of youth.
History's done by young people. If you look at the age, look at the French Revolution, at the age of people when they're actually in positions of power. Right. It's very young people. Yeah. And we have this idea, because historians tend to be older, that somehow history is old. Well, the actors of history tend to be young people. How old was Alexander when he...
he was only 30, early 30s when he died, kind of...
great teenagers of history.
Yeah, great teenagers of history. I think it's going to be a much more diversified future. But we are in a big battle against the future of the humanities as a whole in this country. And the war on television, the war on public service broadcasting is quite overt. And we'll have to see what happens in the near future.
We have a strange thing. We've had a government that doesn't actually recognise or value the things we're actually good at. What we're good at in this country is culture. We're good at universities. We're good at education. We're good at heritage, as well as financial services and other things. There's almost a kind of frustration that the things that we excel at aren't the things that our politicians would like us to be good at, despite how much money they bring in. I mean, the screen industry is bringing in, I think, 2.6 billion in taxes a year. No other industry has to fight for its right to exist the way that the cultural sector does. We constantly have to remind people that we actually run at a profit, that British films and television, whenever I make a program that's sold abroad, I think, well, that's money coming into Britain that's then taxed from another country. We always seem to be justifying our existence in the cultural sector, in the humanities.
And on that note...
On that depressing note...
Well, no, because it's in our hands. We can do it. Yeah. And, Amanda Iannucci, who's constantly railing against the attacks on the screen industries, I think it does it really, really well. We need to be, better at lobbying, as it were.
Yeah.
But having a government that doesn't hate us so much would help.
That would help, as would honest diagnosis, because I think that's something that's very, very lacking in contemporary kind of conversation in all kinds of just pretending that the problem isn't there to begin with. Okay, I'm going to open up the floor to questions. If you just raise your hands, somebody will come round with a mic, and we'll go from there. So we have one question here. Anybody else?
I'd be interested to hear your views on the presentation of history on television for the very young, in particular the impact of horrible histories. And
yeah, I'm probably the wrong person to ask, because I don't listen to horrible histories, so I can't judge its effectiveness. But everybody says and my kids are too old to listen to things like that. If they watched television at all, which they don't. But
I will say, as a lecturer, I know many, many students who have come to history, to university to study history, whose gateway was horrible histories. It's an enormously successful and important series in kind of making students interested in a lasting way in all kinds of histories.
And when the Imperial War Museum North had its exhibition on horrible histories, it was the most popular exhibition they have ever had in the history of the Imperial War Museum North. And it was a really sobering conversation I had with the then director, who we've worked really closely with IWMN in our filmmaking course. And he said, it's really what young little kids, primary school kids, it's all about making it live and enlivening and thrilling and exciting. And they just love it. And that is the start of the journey, because we love history because we're passionate about it, and that passion came from somewhere. And maybe, maybe it was when we were really little. So I think horrible histories are actually a really great start. And also, why not start with the horrible? Because it's quite horrible.
Students love the horrible even when they arrive. I teach histories of extinction and genocide, and it's extraordinary how students will flock to things you think are horrendous. So,
I think the other thing which is a real positive that's happening in history and children is a lot of historians are now writing children's versions of their books. Peter Frankopan really began this. He had to persuade his publishers to allow him to do a children's version of Silk Road. But I interviewed Satnam Sanghera last weekend. He's done a children's book. James Holland, the Second World War historian, has produced a children's version of one of his books. I'm publishing my third children's book in September. So, that's a big thing. That a successful history book, a publisher will now say, well, why not do a version for young adults or do an illustrated version? That's a really new phenomenon, and I think it's really positive.
any other questions? There's a lady.
I'm trying to frame this as an open question, so I'm learning from you as we go. But I'm just interested in what you think about the distinctions between how we report on history in the UK and what questions we're willing to ask or not ask deliberately, and how it's kind of done in other countries, kind of from a global perspective.
In our willingness to engage with all of our history.
Yeah.
I mean, the area I know best is the empire, and I think the positive you could take is Britain is not the country that's most convinced its empire was a force for good in the world, and would like to see it return. That honour lies with the Dutch, who have, I think, the most deluded version of how the world sees their empire. It's very difficult for the Dutch because their golden age that they want us to think about in terms of Vermeer and Rembrandt is also the age of the Dutch colonial empire, Dutch slavery, incredible violence in what's now Indonesia. So I think many countries have this popular, affirming version of their history that has a shadow that they don't want to acknowledge. And I think Britain's not unique in any way in that. I think what's disturbing about this moment is that nervousness, that discomfort with history is being used, it's been exploited for electoral gain. And when we talk about the reactions, what happened to the National Trust, we mustn't pretend that this is an organic reaction. There was not people bursting into the streets because the National Trust had to report into the links between its properties and slavery and empire. That was a confected campaign by billionaire-funded think tanks and newspapers owned by oligarchs. So the fact that there are votes and triangulations within an attack on history, which after 14 years of failed government is all they've got, we have to recognise that this is not taking place in a world only of good faith actors. Yeah, naming no names.
I mean, when the big brouhaha rose about, the big controversy rose about slavery reparations, Colston statue and all that, letters were sent out by the government departments to all major heritage organisations telling them in quite uncertain terms that they were in receipt of public funds and in no circumstances were they to step over the line, to let alone taking things away from their collections and this kind of stuff. They were really leaned on. So it is a real culture war. But all countries, as David says, are doing that. I mean, in the States, of course, has been very reluctant to acknowledge how their history. We were just talking about it before we came on air. The Tulsa massacre of 1921. Suddenly, on the 100th anniversary, the sources came flooding out, and even memories of survivors that had been recorded, and all that sort of stuff. Thousands of people were killed, and the big debate going on in the National Council of Public History in the States is how do we tell we've only been taught to tell the glorious story, the glory. How do we tell the gory with the glory? How do we acknowledge that the American empire not only committed genocide, America not only committed genocide against the indigenous inhabitants of the Americans, but have waged war all over the world. How do we tell that while still acknowledging that the great things that America did? And it's a very, very tricky one. But out of it, there are very important issues which David has spoken about a lot. If you, as a citizen, watch history on television, or you see royal ceremonials, or this, that, and the other, and you don't feel that you have any stake in this, then there are real issues for society over that. You have to find a way of creating a history for teaching in schools and stuff like that, which is inclusive and meaningful to everybody. And the disturbing thing about our culture wars at present is that there's a sizable bunch of people out there who don't want to engage with that at all.
I guess the question is why? Why don't we want to do that? Is it because a lot of history has been about building up a concept of national identity that is a very narrow view of what national identity is? And on that has been national myths of self. And whether you're a French national or an American or an Australian or a British person, you have been living and growing up in an environment in which a very singular narrative of what your national identity is has been, only very rarely challenged. And so history, when it comes to look at sort of these awful stories or these contradictory or these challenges, starts to sort of unpick the national self. And maybe we just need to find a way of not feeling so threatened that this is not about unpicking national identity. It's about having a more coherent, more broad, more full and enriched sense of what the nation was and how it has become.
But that conversation's only possible in a world without bad faith actors. That generational shift, that reassessment, that is the normal way in which history is absorbed and consumed and develops and evolves, is being deliberately and purposefully misrepresented. And it's partly because, there are two things you can get from this culture war. One is votes and one is money. Yeah. We have an algorithmic, the algorithms behind social media, behind campaigning, push towards extremism. There are votes to be had in making British people feel that parts of British history delivered to them by British institutions and British historians is actually an attack on them and British history. And I don't think that the late cabinet was full of people with very fine history degrees. I don't think any of them are at least been interested in these debates. The people in the think tanks and behind the scenes, like Munira Misra, who launched these culture wars, this is based on what think tanks tell them. Yeah. How do you create divisions? How do you create wedge issues? How do you make people frightened? How do you other minority groups? How do you? We've had a government that will attack nurses. Historians are pretty soft targets if you will attack nurses. If you'll take on Marcus Rashford, you'll quite happily take on historians. Yeah. So there's money and there's votes in this. So the conversation you're describing is what a grown-up society would have in a world with honest politicians and a functioning press. And I don't think we've had either of those things for quite a long time.
Well, the history wars, as they were called in Australia, they started 2 decades, even more ago.
But the first country that had Murdoch, I don't think it's a surprise.
Probably.
The history wars began in Australia.
Yeah, under the John Howard government. It was very much a political agenda. And, there were historians who were aligned to it, who came out and, aligned themselves to a very right-wing agenda. And that legacy was huge in Australia. It has not shaken it. It's only really starting to shake it now with a change in government, but also people got tired, I think, after 20 years of incredible, hostile, outrageous claims that were made in the history wars, as they're actually called. People got tired of it. So I think there is still perhaps a yearning to learn, but it isn't an easy road for sure.
I think we're doing quite well as a country, despite the politicisation and the toxification of these debates.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's an either or. I think you're right, that is the conversation that is happening and should be happening. The problem is that riding that wave are bad faith actors who see either monetization or electoral advantage.
Yeah. definitely. It worked in Australia. It worked, the history wars.
Yeah, I mean,
For
last
20
year.
years.
Yeah, I mean, last year we saw an election in Virginia. I mean, almost certainly won on the issue of creating the idea that certain forms of African American history were alien narratives that were offensive to Americans and attacks on white people. So you can win elections
Yes.
by attacking history and historians.
Yeah. Yes.
They're all doing it. I mean, this sounding thing this week is the Indian elections, where history wars have been at the very centre of the BJP's rise to power since 1980, including completely fabricated stories of, mosques built on the top of temples and all that kind of stuff. And it was very seductive in North India, and they won 2 elections. And the third election, when they were almost confidently predicting 400 seats, their majority has been massively cut. I was talking to friends in Tamil Nadu, which they didn't get 1 seat in Tamil Nadu, and you can see that there's some instinctive revulsion to this kind of politics that's going so far in this kind of identity politics, if you like.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah. So this has been such an interesting way to start the day. Thank you all very much. I've been struck as I've been listening how when we talk about young people's interest in history, we end up focusing on sort of near history or identity. I have a 14-year-old who's at a school with a fantastic history curriculum, and he came home and said, "No, we're learning it all different to how you learnt it." I said, "Well, that's brilliant. What have you been reading today?" "Oh," he said, "it's this bloke called A.J.P. Taylor." And I thought, oh, right, okay. But importantly, it was through a critical lens. It wasn't sage on the stage. Which bits of old history are your students being inspired and driven to investigate? And how do you think that the television discourse around near history and old history is shaping that?
By old history, you mean?
Well, beyond living memory.
Beyond living memory.
I'm not sure how to answer that.
I would say my students, certainly the things that they want to know most about, or the documents and sources that they're most interested in, are anything about people's everyday lives, memoirs, written testimonies, those kinds of things, especially from anyone who they feel they have never heard from within their history education. So whether that's women's history, whether that's Black British history, whether that's histories of empire and so on, anything they feel that they've never encountered before, but preferably from the perspective of those people, rather than the ways in which they've been erased by subsequent historians. And I think that's to be welcomed.
I sort of took that as a historiographical question. That's why I was slightly stumped. Yeah, we do teach historiography, which sort of the history of history writing. But it's not very sexy because it's pretty boring. Like what historians used to say about the past. But they are the building blocks. In terms of our sort of undergraduate program, I think, students come with a really open mind. They want to know everything. And I teach war and conflict and history of human rights. So, we have our courses and students will choose those courses. So I think they are interested in conflict. And I think that's also because they live in a world of war. They live in a world of conflict. And they're very curious about it and want to perhaps find ways to understand it and find ways to find some peace and find when did it work? How did we heal? What did we do? Where did human rights come from? Why are they under threat? Why is the Refugee Convention, 1951 Refugee Convention, why is it under threat? They have very burning questions that are shaped by their present world, shaped by where they're living, but they want to know how did we get here? And I think that is the inquiring mind that they have. So I guess we want to draw that out of them. So it is about going back to the past and going, how did we get here? And having a really open mind and open discussion, which is what we do at university, which is why it's so thrilling to be a teacher.
I mean, you're talking about old history, and I've always felt that teaching history at schools and should, at least in senior schools, should really focus on the things that the kids most want to know. I've always argued the British Empire should be at the centre of the school curriculum in Britain. And I've argued that for 30 years. I don't think it's going to happen. But in terms of, obviously, in terms of war and how do we get there and all that, the contemporary history, that's very dynamic for students. If you're looking at old history, biography is still a great way in, I think, for kids. I think grand synoptic studies of history are much more difficult for... I mean, I still find them quite difficult. I've bought 1 or 2 grand synoptic histories recently, and I've not got through beyond the first kind of 50 pages. So I think biography is a really, really great way of... You learn all kinds of things from biographies, and it makes you look out to context and all that.
No, nothing to add.
All right. I would also add, actually, that students are really interested in learning about anything that will help them build the word they want. And it's not necessarily about age, but it's much more about where is that writer coming from and how will that help them learn about things they want to know about, but also create a world that they think is better. And with that kind of beautiful impatience that youth has, as well as kind of, I would not say naivety, but I would actually say hope. And like, it's quite extraordinary, actually, what they can take from so many different things and so on. Any other questions? Sorry, can you use the mic, please?
Thank you very much, and very interesting. But I wanted to just touch on what you're saying about biographies and how sometimes biographies can sort of change your opinions of people, particularly when there's a sort of a revisionist interpretation. Just recently, I've read Mary Tudor, who seems to be having been vilified for almost 300 years or more, somehow now is becoming a little less vilified. I think it's Linda Porter who wrote the latest sort of biography. How do you feel about fashion in history a bit? I mean, would you say that's a good thing, or we should just go with it? And
yes, I mean, isn't history... I get perplexed still by politicians who say we shouldn't rewrite history, as if that isn't the historian's precise job, is to rewrite history. So yes, fashion is interesting and very revealing. I mean, Mary Tudor's a classic case where the kind of history that we grew up with at school in the 1960s, of course, the Catholic period before the Reformation was just gross superstition, corruption. It was great that we got rid of it. There was no, and the revisionist historians like Eamon Duffy's stripping of the altars shows how dynamic. There was a kind of Catholic revival in the 3 decades before the Reformation began. So it's part of understanding history is understanding that there are really major different views, and you know, that's part of the fun of it. It can be disconcerting sometimes, but...
I think that's also about... See, I wouldn't call it fashion. What I would call it is it's a dynamic discipline. And we have new knowledge. What, you know, young people coming through, doing history degrees, doing PhDs, publishing their work. It isn't a static discipline. It's constantly changing because we're unearthing new ways of understanding the same sources. I mean, ancient historians, you know, they're not digging up new documents every year, but they're constantly revising what they have known and constantly looking at, oh, we can see that in a different way. And actually, if we compare that with that document or that piece of archaeology, excuse me, this chair, then they come up with new views and new perspectives and new ways of understanding things, or a new question. And, you know, writing a history dissertation at university in 3rd year or doing an MA or whatever, it's all about coming up with the question. And that is why you might call it fashion, but it isn't really fashion. It's about the development of new knowledge.
I think fashion's a dangerous word. I know you didn't mean it in those terms, but it's one of those words that's been weaponized against historians as fashionable. It's the same way as modern art is described as fashionable. It's a way of delegitimizing it. It's a word that's used very, very deliberately. I mean, I'm always surprised that newspapers and politicians think that they can make this argument against history. Because when I go to history conferences and sit around with other historians, we don't look very fashionable. I don't think there's many. It's a very hard argument to make that these are people who are enslaved by fashion when you sort of look at the average dress of an historian, and yet it seems to sort of work on the Daily Mail. Obviously, with the exceptions of my fellow panelists, but we're fashionable. But I always think it's an odd charge when I scan the room across a history conference that these are the most fashionable people subject to the whims of fashion.
You'd have thought he would have made an effort.
Exactly.
That's a challenge to anyone inviting David to their conference.
It's a strange argument to make. These people with patches on their elbows. And,
I think there was a question there. Yeah.
To ask about a couple of things that you mentioned about the sort of evolution of television, really going from the point, Michael, you made when you started that there were 2 channels, and then that Anna mentioned that a lot of students now are making films for YouTube and these sort of online tools. I wanted to kind of bring back that concept of hope, and that whether all of the new technology that's available to young people today, and also the new business models coming into TV with the streaming services, whether you see opportunities in that for a democratization of history and bringing like new voices to the fore and out to a wider audience, because I wonder whether you see that might help to kind of combat that constant need to justify your existence if people are actually able to bring all those voices in. And I wondered if you could respond to that.
I mean, I don't think the streamers have done a brilliant job so far. I think their drama is world class, a real challenge to traditional terrestrial television. I think the history on the streaming services, the history documentaries have not been great. They've been much, much better at contemporary stories. Older history beyond photography and archive, I think the streamers have really struggled, because to bring those histories to life, what you really need is someone like Michael who can make it magical. And they don't make presenter-led programs because that makes things geographically specific. So the streaming services have a real limitation in what they'll do. I mean, there's a new series on Netflix at the moment just come out about, which is in theory about the Nuremberg trials, and William L. Shirer, who was the American correspondent in Germany in the 30s through to, I think, 1942 or 1941. And I think that's great. And it's one of the best things I've seen Netflix do, but it's 80 years ago. There's photography, there's film, there's Shirer's diaries. I can't imagine the great ancient history series. And some of the programs made by American broadcasters and streaming services about ancient history, I think, are appalling. The Ancient Apocalypse. What's the program that looks for the aliens who built the Nazca Lines, which is the most racist program on television, because it goes around the world to places outside of Europe and says, well, which alien in civilization will have built this monument? Because it couldn't possibly be these brown people, which is almost a sort of, it's what anthropologists did in Africa. They looked for the lost white tribe who created the Benin Bronzes or Great Zimbabwe. So I think there's some absolutely appalling, morally challenged, I think disgusting programs made on the streamers. But I'm increasingly seeing better things. I have more hope. But their limitations are based on the fact that they're making things for a global audience. Though Michael's made some programs that have, you've made programs brilliantly successfully about China that have been popular in China and outside of China.
But traditional presenter-led shows. But interesting, the Chinese audience response, judging by all the messages we get and the way they're displayed online in China, is a lot of them go back to the same thing that we've been talking about, which is how do you create films that have an emotional content to them as well. But yeah, they're still traditional shows. I mean, I'm an old dog, really, David.
It's still popular. Just it constantly has to claim its popularity. You have to remind people.
I think also,
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And they go to a lot of countries, as you were saying. You know, you can 140, 150 countries. So there's a wide audience for traditional presenter-led shows, even actually.
just to come back to your point about hope, I mean, I suppose our students who are making films aren't going to be streamed on Netflix, but they are going around the festival circuit. So there's a lot of documentary film circuits in the UK that provide a platform and a starting point to actually go public. That's a starting point, as well as obviously YouTube, and that's how you build audience, that's how you build fan base, and that's how students, young people are doing it their own way. And that's how they want to start off their career, kickstart it and keep going from there. But yeah, I mean, the other thing is I think there are very presenter-led modes of documentary, but I just started watching D-Day, The Unheard Tapes, yesterday. And it's, I can't even remember what I'm watching it on, it might be BBC. Yeah. And I have to say, it's so creative. It is such a creative idea to have actors lip sync, audio archive from Germany. It's not the usual British story or Australian story or Canadian story. They've got actors from, or audio archive from the US, from Canada, from Britain, and it's actually extraordinary, and it brings to life in a very sort of moment by moment what it was like to take the landings from sea and from air and so forth. And I think it's a really remarkable piece of taking archive that we've never heard before and in a transnational story and making it actually very personal. And the actors, I mean, they're just so clever. The actors, every time they just say something, rather than like a quotation that you'd read in a book, the actors' faces seem to sort of reflect after what they've said, and you can see they're actually coping with articulating what they've actually been through, as they're now sort of elder men, but they're played by younger actors. It's a very, very clever way of taking something moment by moment and making it very sort of present and real and demanding and demands your attention, and a very clever piece of filmmaking just based on audio. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of the panel, and we will no longer demand your attention. But may I please ask you to join me in thanking our panel?
And thanking our audience.
And thank you all for coming and participating. John.
Thank you very much, Sadia. So thanks, everybody. We had a really wonderful event, and thanks to our online audience, I meant to say as well, who are joining us for the live stream. But we're really lucky to have such brilliant colleagues here in the history department, and also such a rallying call for history. So really, really great. And we're going to be asking you to leave the tent and maybe get yourself a cuppa outside, because we're going to be setting up for a music event. So please do come back. We're going to have a choir in here, the Cantos Choir, mostly University of Manchester graduates, in half an hour or so. And across the festival, David will be back in a little while at a Guardian live event, which some of you may have tickets for. And Michael's band is going to be playing on Sunday as well, I should say, which is going to be a really amazing event on Sunday evening. And lots more on the history side, of course, at Manchester Histories Festival is our great partner in this weekend. So thanks again.
History, hope and joy, people.